Hello and welcome to episode 395 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan, as always, joined by Evan Silva. Today, we have a very, very special guest, an annual guest. This young man has dedicated his life to manually charting how NFL wide receivers fare in isolation. I mean, full-blown team no sex, but I love it. It is Matt Harmon of Yahoo and Reception Perception. Matt, how's it going, buddy?
Things are great. Yeah, man. I mean, it is definitely one of the most virgin activities you can probably do. And, you know, the more and more I actually have a real personal life, it is tough. It's tough to, there's so many wide receivers. There's so many guys to chart out there. And yeah, I appreciate you guys having me every single year. This is like, this off season more than ever feels like there's more interesting player debates and fun guys to kind of kick around. And I hope that Reception Perception could be a big part of kind of trying to settle some of these big player debates out there, or at least point us in the right direction.
You said that's the most virgin activity you can do. I mean, you have no idea what we're doing here, Harmon. We are projecting for the USFL fifth string wide receiver target shares in the USFL. Okay. And we're getting ready for preseason, in which we'll be looking at like sixth and seventh string wide receivers. Guys are going to be working at Safeway next week. So yeah, you can do more virgin things. It's pretty virgin, but you can certainly do more virgin things. Anyways, Evan, how's it going?
It's going great. On the Swolecast, RIP in peace. I don't think that show even is still around anymore. But when I used to go on the Swolecast, I would drink out of like this big gallon jug. And I've kind of moved on from that. I like drinking out of metal these days, Yetis, you know. But nice. Matt Harmon right now is drinking out of just a beautiful, massive jug. We got to see it. Let the people look.
Yeah. I mean, I'm behind because I'm only at like I don't really give a damn about the markers, but I do finish one of these at least a day. And awesome. Yeah, I'm dedicated, man. And people ask us like, well, don't you, by the end of it, it's not like, you're drinking out of the Yetis. You're constantly like having well temperature, cool drinks, all that. Like by the end of it, isn't it just kind of warm and miserable? Yeah. The jug is warm and miserable by the end, but it's all about dedication and perseverance. That's what this thing's all about.
I mean, it's I don't like it when I pee and I see yellow. It has to be clear.
No, clear. If you're not pissing clear out there, you're doing it wrong.
Oh my God, two water bros talking about water strat. All right. On today's show, we're going to dive into wide receivers and how good they actually are. I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about certain wide receivers, a lot of assumptions. And honestly, it's hard to separate a wide receiver from his quarterback. We have a lot of spots like that this year. We're not going to necessarily get into all of them, but guys like Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams, who are very clearly going into quarterback downgrades, we're going to find out a lot more about how good they actually are. Before we get into that, I have to remind everyone this show is brought to you by our friends at Underdog Fantasy, undoubtedly the smoothest, highest stakes, best user experience for anyone trying to play best ball. Promo code ETR when you sign up for $100 matching deposit bonus. And of course, we are continuously updating our underdog rankings, and all our rankings, you can upload them directly from ETR into the Underdog app. All right. Why don't you remind the people here, Harmon, a little bit about your process? How do you get to your takes on all these players? How do you get the data? What is the process for evaluating wide receivers for reception perception?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a novel idea, but my thought is that the only way you can really decide how good a wide receiver is by watching them, because anytime you're going in with like a yards per whatever metric, a target metric, you're welcoming the influence of the quarterback and even more variables than that. Obviously, the offensive system that they run in, the role that they play, the surrounding players that they're with. I mean, I think Hayden Winks, I saw, put out a really good post about how even like a great metric like yards per route run can be really dictated by the guys that you're playing with. When Chris Godwin goes out, Mike Evans yards per route run shoots up. So, I mean, all that stuff makes sense. So really way back in the day when I was living in shout out Fairfax, Virginia, actually, no, it was Lynchburg, Virginia at the time I was living in, when I decided like, I'm going to try to make my way into this whole football space. And I wanted to kind of carve out a niche, trying to cut out the noise with wide receiver analysis and try to isolate them from those surrounding variables as much as possible. So what I do for reception perception is go in over an 8-game sample for NFL players and college prospects are back now on receptionperception.com the last couple of years. Basically, just I chart every single route that they run, how often they get open on those route types, how often they get open versus man, zone, press coverage. So basically, like I said, the goal is to isolate wide receivers from quarterback, other surrounding variables, so that we can really decide not only how good they are, but also what roles do they fit best in? What teammates do they accompany well with? I mean, there are certain quarterbacks that fit better with certain types of receivers, and I think that matters a lot, obviously, then when we're projecting them for fantasy and everything like that.
I agree with you that inability to get open is in really like maybe the most important skill. That's what earns targets. But there's some guys who can win without getting open. In other words, like Mike Williams, I think comes to mind. I don't know if you agree or not, but like Mike Williams comes to mind as someone who necessarily doesn't get open that much, but is still obviously a very, very valuable wide receiver. How do you think about guys like that for reception?
Yeah, I think there are guys like Mike Williams, and Mike Williams I actually think is not as bad of a separator as people have given him, have kind of knocked him for coming out of college. But yeah, that's also why I include metrics like contested catch rate, yards after the catch, how many tackles they break in the open field. Because you're right, there are certain guys that are not the elite separators. Mike Williams certainly comes to mind, but he's better than somebody than like a Devontae Parker or like the Devin Funchess types who like wash out of the league. Like very rarely do these guys finish below like the 10th percentile, 15th percentile consistently and end up, winning or making great careers in the long run. So certainly, yeah, I mean, there are guys that obviously can be great contested catch players, but even a guy like a Mike Williams, I would say he's an average NFL separator, not a poor NFL separator. So yeah, there are certainly a scale to it, but there are certain guys like Mike Evans. I mean, Mike Evans is a great example of a player. I was just posting this morning that, he's somebody that people think he's still just a jump ball receiver, but the guy's been above 70% success rate versus man coverage, which is a really good indicator I found over the years of like, that's a pretty good, like you're going to find a hit rate there at some point. You're going to find some level of NFL success if you're an outside perimeter receiver and you consistently clear that 70% success rate versus man coverage number. Again, that's a really good indicator. He's done that most of his seasons in his career. So I would say that sometimes we typecast guys based on size, pre-workout metrics, stuff like, or pre-draft workout metrics, stuff like that into these roles that really actually they don't really fit.
All right. I pulled out, 10, 15 guys here that I thought were interesting that I was interested in, and I wanted to get Matt and Evan's take on. I want to start with Stefon Diggs. I know Stefon Diggs did not have a disappointing year, right? You can't go for 103 catches, 1,200 yards, and 10 touchdowns and be disappointing. But I feel like Steph Diggs left a lot of meat on the bone last year, given how much Buffalo passed, given how often Steph Diggs was targeted in the end zone and the red zone. I feel like he actually should have had a bigger season. So I'm curious, Matt, was that due to poor play on the behalf of Steph Diggs, or is this just kind of a blip on the radar? And again, I don't want to knock Steph Diggs for like a bad year or anything. Yeah. He had a fine year, but I just felt like it should have been more.
I kind of agree with you. And I think that there was always sort of like it was a given that he was going to swing back from his like wildly efficient 2020 season into something that was more normal. But I would not be surprised at all if he smashes this upcoming season. Because last year, I don't think it was anything to do with his individual play. He's at the 97th percentile success rate versus man coverage and 97th against press, 94th against zone. Like he was up there getting open and getting separation at all levels of the field. This is a guy that's been one of the best route runners in the NFL over the last 5 years. He still owns the number one success rate versus man coverage score in reception perception all time. Obviously that came in his 2020 season. So I don't really see any drop off from his play individually. He was double covered a lot. We have the double covered metric at reception perception, and he was only behind Devontae Adams last year, which is not a surprise in terms of the routes that he was double covered on. So I think they need more from the other guys around Stefon Diggs to sort of, number one, take some of that defensive attention off. But we also sort of forget too that with like the last memory that we have of Josh Allen was him, absolutely smashing in the postseason, everything like that. There were certainly some rockier moments. So I think some of that is also what influences the Steph Diggs efficiency metrics. But yeah, I think this could easily be his best season. And I think number one wide receiver overall is in his range of outcomes, because you just look at the guys around him and, Gabe Davis has been an inconsistent player so far. Obviously somebody that a lot of people have a lot of hope for. And I can sort of buy into him taking a next step there, because he's taken pretty good steps in each of his last two seasons. But then it's like, potential goofballs like Jamison Crowder and Isaiah McKenzie and stuff behind him. So I wouldn't be surprised if Steph Diggs has a huge target share this year and really does, again, have another smash season.
Steph Diggs and Josh Allen hit so many big plays in 2020. Like there was just always going to regress back toward the mean. Steph Diggs, I mean, people just got like their expectations got too high, I think, for Steph Diggs. He's still had a really good season. Yeah. He's been one of the best route runners in the league for a long time. I think that the point you made about how we saw more double teams last year, though, was interesting, because I know you've made the point in the past that a lot of people think that double teams happen a lot more than they actually do in the NFL. Greg Cosell has talked about this as well. I mean, defenses will shade coverage toward a guy, but an actual double teams, I don't know. Just can you speak about that for a second, Matt?
Yeah, people definitely talk about double coverage a lot more than it actually happens. You know, people assume like that just any old number one wide receiver is going to get double covered, you know, throughout a certain game. It's just not true, because you think about it, you start, and then if anyone says, I know I've said this in the past, if people talk about like, oh, this guy's getting triple teamed or something, it's like, just, you're kind of talking out of your ass in that case, because that's so rare. If you're triple teaming one guy, you're just conceding yards and points. Like another third receiver can suck as bad as they are, but if you're dictating three guys, to the math is just not going to work out, right? Or you're not going to put any pressure on the passer, that type of stuff. So it certainly is very rare. I mean, and we're talking about Stefon Diggs. I said he was number 2 last year. He's still at 18% of his routes. It's actually number 2 all time. Him and Davante Adams from last year, they're the first and second highest double covered rates of all time. And I mean, this is dating in reception perception history back to 2014. But again, that's still Davante Adams, like 22% of his routes, Stefon Diggs, 18% of his routes. So it's much less common than people think. But that's number 2 all time. So I think there is some level of a defensive attention, defensive pressure that they can take off of Stefon Diggs if some of these guys emerge.
You know, I look at things from a DFS perspective mostly, and the reason that it feels disappointing, Steph Diggs only had 2 100-yard games all year and only had 1 multi-touchdown game all year. In other words, he never had like the spike weeks that we need for DFS. So every time you played him on DraftKings at like 8K or 8,500, like you were losing. You know what I mean? And it's not that he had a bad year, just he didn't have the spike weeks. That's all. It wouldn't be a fantasy bro podcast if we didn't get a Gabe Davis take. I know you mentioned him briefly here, Thorman. It seems like everybody has a Gabe Davis take. I mean, Steph Diggs getting double teamed a lot can't be a bad thing, even if it's only 18% of the time. Can't be a bad thing for Gabe Davis. What do you think about all the controversy about people's Gabe Davis takes?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm going to come down on like the most boring centrist side of the hot Gabe Davis debate. It's like, I totally understand why people are excited about him. I mean, he obviously scores 4 touchdowns in a freaking playoff game. By the way, you don't score 4 touchdowns in a playoff game without 1, obviously playing really well, but 2, having the defense screw it up on the other side a couple of times. You know, you go back and watch that game, like, you know, guys are falling over in the secondary, you know, just blowing coverages, stuff like that. So, I like Gabe Davis as a potential boomer bust number 2 receiver for the Bills. How much is that worth in fantasy? I know he's gotten steamed up a ton. That makes a ton of sense. Do I think he's a great separator? Definitely not. You know, like we're talking 64% success rate versus man coverage. That's around the 33rd percentile. I wouldn't be surprised though if he levels out as like a Devontae Parker type of player. And I know Parker has let people down because of injuries, stuff like that. But I don't know if you guys would disagree. Evan, I don't know if you disagree, but I would say that Parker at best was like an average NFL starter. I think Gabe Davis can be like an average NFL starter, but a Devontae Parker type of player, average NFL starter in this situation, that's why people are excited, right? I mean, and I get that. I think you can think that Gabe Davis is potentially an overhyped, maybe average talent, but still be really excited about him in fantasy and still want to draft him. I guess it just depends on the ADP and the cost. I've said all along, you know, I know that like drafters on Underdog and best ball players are drafting Gabe Davis really high. I'm actually very excited to see where Gabe Davis falls when like the normal people start drafting. And I say normal people, nobody get offended. I say it with love for the sickos out there that are drafting right now. You're the lifeblood of the business. We appreciate you. Keep drafting. Keep being totally not normal. But I can't wait to see where like more casual players start to draft him when it comes to like, you know, August and early September.
It's okay to be normal. I mean, you know, it's normal to be normal. But yeah, the situation is it's so positive. I mean, there's just going to be so much opportunity. Gabe Davis is, you know, a big receiver who can win in some difficult situations. I understand he's not a great route runner. There's a reason he was a 4th round pick. There's a reason that, you know, Brian Daboll, it took a long time for him to commit to Gabriel Davis over Emmanuel Sanders last year. But, you know, I think as Josh Norris has put it kind of eloquently, like the runway has been cleared for Gabe Davis and the situation is just screaming out for him to be like, it's almost going to be difficult for him to fail. If you look at the depth chart, the complexion of the offense, the high pass frequency.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
And he took a legit step.
And he could still be just like an average NFL wide receiver and be really good in fantasy because of all those factors.
For sure.
And he took a pretty nice step from year 1 to year 2 in reception perception. Like, I mean, he took a pretty decent jump, and we've seen guys like, Courtland Sutton do the same thing. I mean, his career has kind of gone off the track because of the ACL injury, stuff like that. But, guys like Kenny Golladay, guys like Courtland Sutton, like I mentioned, they take that steady incremental jump. There are some guys who, and especially, these great technicians coming out of school, they're immediately good, in terms of route running, separation, stuff like that. Some of these other guys, like, it takes a little while for them to get up to average.
All right, let's move on from the Bills. And I want to ask about CeeDee Lamb. This is a guy similar to Steph Diggs, who, like, I absolutely love CeeDee Lamb. I absolutely love Steph Diggs. But again, in DFS, like, you were losing money playing CeeDee Lamb last year for the most part. Final 9 games of the year, he didn't have any 100-yard games, only scored 2 touchdowns. Now you remove Amari Cooper, you remove Michael Gallup on the knee injury. Can CeeDee Lamb be the alpha number 1 dominant wide receiver for Dallas? I think they really need him to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you have to pay the iron price to draft CeeDee Lamb this year, but it's just like Evan said with Gabriel Davis. It's going to be really, really hard for CeeDee Lamb to fail, I think, because he's just set up so well from a volume perspective. And I think he's really good. And, I think Dallas kind of needs to decide exactly what they want him to be. Like, I think they've done too much flip-flopping. Like, is he a perimeter receiver? Is he a slot receiver? I frankly, personally think he would be better. I mean, he could play in the slot fine. Like, and you want to get your guys like slot targets to get them layup targets. We've seen that over the years, that it's more efficient to do that. And obviously, like, success rates against zone coverage are higher league average than success rate versus man coverage. The more you play outside, the more press coverage, the more man coverage you're going to see. But I mean, CeeDee Lamb can beat man coverage. 91st percentile success rate versus man coverage last year. Like, he can beat press coverage. He can do all of those things. He can win down the field. He can win in short areas. Like, I have zero questions about him as a player. I think Dallas just needs to commit to where they want him to line up. If they want to put him inside, like, make sure it's in advantageous situations. But I think Dallas, obviously, it'd be great if they had more receiver depth. But if they take CeeDee Lamb and put him in Amari Cooper's vacated flanker role, I think that's a huge potential upgrade next year, a year from now, everything like that. I just think he's an extremely talented player. So you got to pay the iron price to get him. But I think I think he's a good dark horse bet to lead the NFL in targets, a dark horse bet to lead the NFL in yards, because he's just set up that well. And I think if Dallas regresses from a defensive perspective, and they were already the number 1 scoring offense last year, I think there's a lot of excitement around them.
Love to hear that. I mean, the success rate versus man coverage is awesome to hear on CeeDee Lamb. The concept of the layup targets is something that I don't think I often refer to them as just, receivers that get higher percentage targets than other receivers. But the concept of the layup targets and the layup catches, like, can you expand upon that? What does that exactly mean? Maybe who are some receivers who get a lot of those, and some receivers that, like, it sounds like Justin Jefferson this year in Minnesota is going to get a lot more layup targets and catches than he has in years past. And I mean, that's exciting to hear.
100%. I mean, and obviously everybody's talking about Justin Jefferson and like the Cooper Kupp role. Cooper Kupp has been the king of layup targets throughout his career. I think obviously used a little bit differently last year because he had a quarterback who wasn't just, so afraid to throw the ball downfield, was only like targeting those layup routes. I mean, quick slants, routes out in the flat, guy like Cooper Kupp, he faces zone coverage on over 70% of his routes. Like, that's entirely different from a guy like Davante Adams or Stefon Diggs, who we just talked about, who plays like as a pure outside receiver. So good scheming obviously comes into it, and quarterback preference obviously comes into it from the layup targets. The analogy I always used to use, and this is because I grew up as like a hate yourself Panthers fan, was like the Panthers did a terrible job getting Cam Newton layup receivers. It was like Kelvin Benjamin, Devin Funchess, these guys who don't really separate. Then obviously they draft guys like DJ Moore, who can get open on those short to intermediate routes over the middle of the field. Christian McCaffrey, obviously, and even Curtis Samuel, those guys were much more layup receivers. So I think that's kind of like the best way to think about it is what happened with Carolina previously, and then what they did, obviously right around too late for when Cam Newton's shoulder fell off.
All right. I want to get to a question. This is probably the number one guy that I wanted to ask you about. Keenan Allen is 30 years old, turned 30 in April. If he's declining, it just means so much for Josh Palmer, for Mike Williams, for this entire team. And I thought there was, in the data at least, I'm no film bro, but in the data, there were serious signs that Keenan Allen last year was starting to show decline. Did you find that? And what do you think about Keenan Allen?
Yeah, I think a slight decline in terms of reception perception, like success rate versus man, press coverage especially. And we know he's more of a slot receiver, was going to see more of some of those layup targets like we were just talking about, more routes against zone coverage. But from a pure speed, I think he's still a great technician, obviously, but he's could be slowing down a little bit, but we're talking like going from, top 8 in the league in success rate versus man coverage to around like the 79th percentile, for example, this past year. So it's definitely a decline. Now, do I think he's about to fall off a cliff or something like that? Probably not. I think he's still the best receiver on the Chargers roster. I think he's still a better player than Mike Williams. Obviously, though, Mike Williams gets more of those like high leverage targets down the field, more of those high leverage targets in contested situations in the red zone. But I think you could argue that there's a slight decline for Keenan Allen, but I don't know that it's enough. Like, I know this is like a big debate. Do you rank Mike Williams or Keenan Allen ahead of each other? I think I'm still going to put Keenan Allen, when I come out with my projections and like the tiers and stuff on receptionperception.com, I'll probably still have Keenan Allen over Mike Williams, but I think the gap has closed there.
It's just Keenan Allen's yards per route run, and and when you correlate it with his age, his yards per route run have gone down like 5 straight years.
Yeah,
and he's like, he's 30 now.
Yeah.
So that those are the scary things with him. I don't know. My question is like, are the Chargers going to actively start to structure their offense to feature Mike Williams more? Obviously, he's younger. They just gave him a big deal. Keenan Allen is, getting, he's aging. Yeah. So will the structure of the offense start to more favor Mike Williams as opposed to Keenan Allen?
Well, last year at the beginning of the year, they changed Mike Williams' role. I mean, Mike Williams had like an alpha role, and then they went back to like kind of more that vertical streaker role, and he became way more inconsistent. I hope this year that they use Mike Williams the way they did at the beginning of the year, but I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
I think somewhere in the middle is probably a good compromise. Like I hated the way he was used when it was like Phillip Rivers just throwing him lollipops down the field and, just kind of go up. And I mean, Mike Williams is good enough as a vertical separator. Again, I think he's underrated in terms of his ability to get open. Like he's not just some slouch or whatever, like a Kelvin Benjamin. I feel like I've bagged on Kelvin Benjamin 2 times on the show. He's not even in the NFL anymore.
Didn't you try to convert to tight end or something? Like,
he and the Lions signed Devin Funchess as a tight end. So again, that's a shout out Dave Gettleman for the receiver drafts there in Carolina. But no, I think that Mike Williams can be used a little more as like a true X receiver, but I don't think he's good enough to be like the featured player in this offense. Like I think that they can somewhere find a compromise between the two, but I do think that Keenan Allen's probably still a better receiver on this team, but Mike Williams really good player, and I think I don't want to talk too much trash on Mike Williams because I've always thought he was a little underrated, and then heading into last year, obviously you saw some of that.
All right, speaking of our guys good enough, I know Evan thinks that Mike Pittman is good enough. Do you think that Michael Pittman is good enough to be the true alpha for the Colts? Because where he's being drafted now, I mean, you need him to be like the alpha.
Oh, hell yeah. I love
Let's go.
Reception perception was big on Mike Williams last year. He cleared that sort of 70% success rate versus man coverage that you want from like a young outside receiver. But last year I went in like charting his 2021 results with pretty high expectations, and he still somehow blew those out of the water.
You're talking about Pittman now, right? You said Mike Williams, but you're talking about Pittman.
Right? Sorry, Mike Williams on the mind, but talking about Michael Pittman. Yeah, RP was big on Michael Pittman going into his second season. He cleared that 70% barometer that you're looking for. So I went in to last year with pretty good expectations, and he still blew those out of the water, did Michael Pittman. I mean, he's such a good player. 96 percentile success rate versus press coverage. That's up there with guys like Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, AJ Brown from last year, some of the guys we all agree are the best receivers in the NFL. I think that Michael Pittman can join that company after this year. And there are actually, I think, a lot of shades of like an Allen Robinson type of receiver in his game, but I also think there are like some shades of Keenan Allen too, with like, if you look at his route success rate chart on receptionperception.com, the dig route success rate, the curl route success rate, the slant route, like the way he can just thump defenses over and over again on those in-breaking routes, very reminiscent of like a young Keenan Allen. So pretty, it's really easy to get super excited about Michael Pittman. I think he's the guy that, you know, I don't think you can call him a breakout candidate because he already has 1,000 yards and 80 plus catches on his resume, but he can absolutely take that next step with a quarterback that I think is more conducive to winning with this style of player than a guy like Carson. Like people think Michael Pittman's just a jump ball receiver because he played with freaking Carson Wentz last year. And he's definitely much more than that.
All right. Let's go to another teammate situation here. You mentioned Mike Williams versus Keenan Allen is close. I think a lot of people are tied up in knots over Jerry Jeudy versus Courtland Sutton. People are on the clock. They say, I want a Denver receiver. I've been leaning Courtland Sutton, admittedly, mostly due to the Bible narrative. Again, big Bible guy is Courtland Sutton. Big Bible guy is Russ Wilson. But you have a much more dedicated approach. Who do you like more as a player between Jeudy and Sutton?
I mean, I'm not sure that it can get more dedicated than that, but that's a different subject. I mean, you're out there grinding like the Instagram posts for these guys, like what verses they're posting. So that's pretty in deep stuff. But yeah, I'm really struggling with this decision, honestly, because I think that neither one of these guys played their best ball last year from an individual perspective, obviously. And I'm taking out the fact that they played with garbage quarterbacks, but I think you can excuse both of those slumps. Like, this is one thing I've noticed. This is the great part about having like data since 2014 is like, I'm able to track these guys throughout the course of their career. I have noticed that a lot of players in the first year coming off of an ACL tear do suffer, like in terms of their success rate versus man press coverage, in like they're not at their peak performance in that first year after. You know, some examples of guys like Allen Robinson, right? Like he tore an ACL, came back his first year with the Bears and was not at his best, but then his last 2 years with the Bears, or the 2 peak years with the Bears, were awesome, right? So I mean, there's been some guys like that, and Courtland Sutton definitely, from a success rate versus man press coverage, zone coverage, was all down from like his peak 2019 season. But same with Jerry Jeudy, that like he didn't follow up his rookie season with a great individual performance. He was at like 75% success rate versus man in his first season. He's all the way down at like, 68% this last year. So, but that could be an injury situation as well.
Man.
Exactly.
The high ankle sprain will torpedo your season every time.
Yeah.
So that's
week
the tough part here.
Week one last year was for Jerry Jeudy. Week 1 high ankle sprain for Jerry Jeudy last year, came back for the last, 8 games or so, and was not good.
That's the tough part, is that I think you can excuse both of their poor individual, like, and you can't just write off their bad seasons last year totally to quarterback play, although obviously it's like some of the stone worst quarterback play in the NFL last year. Obviously it's a big upgrade with Russell Wilson, but I think you have to kind of decide like who has the better peak season on their resume. I think that's probably Courtland Sutton, but I flip-flop this like back and forth, and I probably will. So honestly, I think my instinct now is that I'm probably not going to be drafting either one of them super highly. I want to see where these guys line up, because Jerry Jeudy's another guy who's been sort of pigeonholed as a slot-only player so far. I think he would be better as an outside flanker, and I think Tim Patrick would actually be a great like big slot receiver, sort of in that like Alan Lazard mold for Nathaniel Hackett, to going back to the Green Bay offenses. So I don't know. It's a extremely tough call here, and I flip-flop back and forth. So that was not a very good answer to the question.
Evan, you in your top 150, Evan, you have Courtland Sutton like a round ahead of Jeudy. What do you think about the Broncos stuff?
Yeah, but then I'm doing a draft right now, and like I just got Jerry Jeudy. So I'm willing to take either of the guys. I like drafting them because I think the upside is there. Russell Wilson has been one of the best deep ball throwers in the NFL since he entered the NFL. I think that tends to suit Courtland Sutton a little bit more. But I think that Jerry Jeudy can be, has the potential to be an elite separator. Yeah. Just based on my knowledge, my evaluation of him. But I mean, I haven't studied him as in depth as Matt Harmon has. But I've always been a fan of Tim Patrick. KJ Hamler's interesting too. But But I don't know. I just like listening to Harmon's thoughts on all this. It's very, very interesting.
All right. Interesting spot is Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, the negatives, the detractors of Amon-Ra St. Brown say that the only reason he exploded last year was because they didn't have Swift, they didn't have Hawkinson, they didn't have Jameson Williams, they didn't have DJ Chark. They had no one. The only person that they were throwing to is Amon-Ra St. Brown. I find that to be an empty argument, but I'm curious, Harmon, what you think of Amon-Ra St. Brown in a vacuum.
Yeah, I'm with you that I think that's kind of an empty argument, misses some of the bigger points going on. I really like Amon-Ra St. Brown as a player. And I know I've talked about like success rate versus man coverage a ton on the show and how that can be a really good indicator for these big time perimeter receivers. But one of the things I've noticed over the last few years, and this was one of the reasons that, shout out to me, I was on Cooper Kupp over Robert Woods heading into last year because this particular role that he's had over the course of his career. And I think it's like a Bud Light version, like a Bud Light Cooper Kupp role that Amon-Ra St. Brown was in to end last season. This was something I actually wrote in his pre-draft profile that this would be the best role for him, sort of like a Cooper Kupp light role, because he's really good at beating zone coverage. He's really good on those layup routes that we talked about earlier, slants, flats, curls, stuff like that. And Jared Goff is like the king of layup targets. Like this is the type of, I love to feel like the synergy between the quarterback and the wide receiver from not just a play style perspective, but the role and then how they actually do it on the field. Like I think he's a legit baller is Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like I think he can really play. I think the arguments that it was just a bunch of, like obviously the target competition wasn't great, but they were already promoting Amon-Ra St. Brown from like a routes run perspective, a snaps played perspective, and really finding that correct role for him when they moved away from like Anthony Lynn as the offensive coordinator, when Dan Campbell took over more of the play calling duties, after the bye his rookie year. So I think he's a legit good player. I think nobody's basically the toughest part about there was no one to throw to, like he's not going to do what he did last year, is like nobody's asking you to believe that, right? Like when I rank him this coming season, I'm not going to rank him like that he's going to do what he did every single week to end last year. And I don't think you guys or anyone else is either.
Right. And you don't do what Amon-Ra St. Brown did down the stretch last year without being able to ball. Like I don't have to study every tape and snap like Matt does, although it would be better. But you don't have to know that Amon-Ra St. Brown could ball, because there's been plenty of guys with limited target competition who don't do anything close to what Amon-Ra did. We've been way higher than market on Amon-Ra. You don't even have to be that high. I mean, Evan has him 53rd overall. I think we have him in the mid 50s or the low 60s, and you still get him a ton at those rankings. So yeah,
Lions were one of the first team previews that I did, and the more I looked into Amon-Ra St. Brown, and look, the C's did kind of part for him. I mean, he had double-digit targets in I think each of the last 6 games last season. But I mean, he's a baller, and I totally agree with that synergy that Jared Goff kind of showed with Cooper Kupp. That can translate to Amon-Ra St. Brown. And also his yards per route run were, for a rookie receiver, almost 2 yards per route run. That puts him in elite company historically. So I have him firmly among the top 30 wide receivers. I think I have him even top 25 among receivers. And I feel very good about him.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of a guy, Evan and I have debated plenty, and we're actually on the other side of Leone and the spreadsheet versions on this. Evan and I, like Allen Robinson, we're willing to throw out last year's debacle. The spreadsheet versions, I think, are baking in a lot of last year, or at least enough of last year to pull Allen Robinson down in the rankings. So you are here to be the decider here, Harmon. Can we throw out last year's disaster season for Allen Robinson? And I guess first, how bad was Allen Robinson last year? Because it seems like he was absolutely atrocious. But anyways, what are your thoughts on Allen Robinson?
Yeah. I mean, I think he was not up to his peak standards. Again, we're talking about a player in 2020 that was number 5 in success rate versus man coverage. Like he wasn't quite that good. So there was certainly some drop off, but I think a lot of people that are like, in the bag for Justin Fields really want you to believe that Allen Robinson was just out there, absolutely like shitting his pants or something like that all year. I completely disagree with that idea. I think there's a lot on the inverse there that you could put the blame. And same thing with like Matt Nagy too, We're looking at Allen Robinson's like route percentage chart on RP, and like it's a bunch of the slants, the curls, like none of the vertical stuff it's great that I think Matt Nagy at certain times has been smart to use Robinson more as an inside receiver. That was great with Mitch Trubisky. I think it just fits so well, but the same issue that is there for Darnell Mooney's route chart last year. It's a bunch of like routes closer to the line of scrimmage. And it's just so stupid when you finally have a quarterback that can really like, not only can let it rip, but that's the first thing Fields wants to do is like let it rip downfield. So it just was a total mess last year. I think you can write it off, but I think the idea that that Allen Robinson was so bad last year from an individual perspective is not correct. Like it's just, he's going into such a great situation. Like This is another one similar to like with Gabe Davis, where I think it's going to be really, really hard for like Allen Robinson would have to be completely cooked to fail in this situation. I think in my opinion, and I don't think he's close to completely cooked.
It just seems like every year people underestimate what Matthew Stafford can do for good wide receivers. Even like Marvin Jones was having like big games and big seasons with Matthew Stafford, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, was Kenny Golladay a creation of Matthew Stafford to some extent? I mean, probably just at least a little bit, right? I mean, Matthew Stafford he's a teammate elevator. And if you look down the depth chart, and I know that this is getting away from what Matt does, but when you look down the depth chart, like there's really not that much target competition beyond Cooper Kupp. You've got some decent guys at tight end, but I mean, like their third receiver might be Tutu Atwell, who literally I've seen him blown off the field, in winds above 20 miles per hour. I mean, this guy is like 5'8", 120. And I mean, he might be the Rams' third receiver this year.
Evan, I think it probably would take like 10 Tutu Atwells to like equal our combined size. We're both tall. We're both big, tall guys. So yeah, I think it would take a lot.
All right. We mentioned Michael Pittman. Is he ready to be the alpha, the number one for a passing offense? The conclusion was yes. We have a similar question, I think, with Rashod Bateman. Marquise Brown is gone. And maybe Rashod Bateman doesn't have to do it as much because Mark Andrews is really the number one wide receiver there. But obviously there's a lot of other stuff going on with the Ravens. Lamar Jackson, its ability to be a thrower, how often they'll throw, blah, blah, blah. I'm more curious, is Rashod Bateman a frontline NFL wide receiver? What say you, Matt?
Yeah, I think so for sure. I'm really, really confident in Rashod Bateman as a player. And I like Marquise Brown as a player a little bit, very good at beating zone coverage, good at some of those deep routes as well. But, if we're talking like the true X receiver, like the traditional number one guy who's going to line up on the outside, consistently beat press coverage, consistently beat man coverage, win on in-breaking routes and out-breaking routes, like that's 100% Rashod Bateman. I think he just checks so many boxes from an individual perspective. I think he's like a Justin Jefferson, like on like a poor man's Justin Jefferson. Like he's on that archetype of a player. So I'm extremely confident. I think he's I've called him the most obvious breakout candidate in the NFL because like he only had like 500 something yards as a rookie, 1 touchdown. I know that obviously Baltimore is not going to run the amount of plays. They're not going to pass as much as they did last year, but I think there's enough in this offense to support Mark Andrews and Rashod Bateman because I think Bateman's going to command volume because he is that good. Yeah. And then we, talk about going down the depth chart. Like you go down the depth chart for the Ravens and it's just like a disaster. So,
disaster.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Evan has Rashod Bateman 64th overall in his rankings. Certainly, anytime the Ravens have to throw, Bateman's going to have a lot of opportunities. I think ideally they only want to throw the ball 20 or 25 times a game, and we'll see if they're able to execute that or not. Let's go to the Steelers stuff while we're in this AFC North. So the gap in ADP between Chase Claypool and Diontae Johnson is massive, like 60, 65 spots. The market clearly thinks that Diontae Johnson is a player and Chase Claypool is not. Now, I get just because Claypool was bad last year, not because I grinded the film, but because he got freaking benched. I mean, he was getting like outright benched last year a bunch of times. So obviously there's questions around Chase Claypool, but man, a 70 spot gap is pretty wide for me. What do you think about the Steelers, Diontae and Claypool?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That's the biggest problem with Chase Claypool is that he was bad last year. Like not just from like you can't just blame Ben Roethlisberger. Like Chase Claypool has to wear some of the blame for his struggles last season, but his rookie season was really promising. Like that's the tough part. Like you don't often see guys go from one end of the extreme to the other in reception perception from year 1 to year 2. But we're talking about a guy that Chase Claypool was good almost across the board as a rookie and then bad across the board in his second season. The one consistent thing throughout the course of his 2 years has been that he's just terrible at contested situations, like, which is such a shame because he's a big guy, but he's been like below a 50% catch rate, a contested catch rate in each of the last 2 years. That's a huge problem. And obviously it was a super big problem last year when there was no more hopeless play in football than Ben Roethlisberger throwing a Chase Claypool on go routes last year, because Claypool couldn't get open. Ben Roethlisberger can't get it down the field, and Claypool doesn't win contested situations. So I'm not all out on Chase Claypool, but I get why the market has Diontae Johnson that much ahead, because I think Johnson, when you isolate him from Ben Roethlisberger, is a great receiver. I mean, I know he gets a ton of like pop gun targets and stuff like that because Ben Roethlisberger stinks and like can't throw the ball down the field. But I think all of like his catch rate metrics, well, I mean, obviously he drops the ball too much, but like his yards per target, stuff like that, it's all because he's playing with Ben Roethlisberger. Like, let's see what he does when he actually gets a real quarterback, because he's been a guy who's been, number 1 or number 2 in success rate versus zone coverage the last 2 years, 91st percentile success rate versus man coverage last year, above the NFL average on every single route except one last season where he was at the average in terms of winning on 9 routes. Like, the guy gets open, the guy gets separation and wins at every level. Like, I just think he is a misunderstood talent, because I think he's like a legit, right there, like a true number 1 receiver. And he's not a slot guy at all. Like, he's done this all while playing like a very difficult X receiver role. That's what the key for me to unlocking the Steelers receivers this year will be, where are these guys going to line up? Because Johnson's never been a slot receiver. I think Claypool actually running as a potential big slot receiver would be awesome. I'm not quite sure where I fall on in terms of where, just because Chase Claypool's 2 seasons have been so extreme at this point. So he's kind of a tough one to judge, but I don't think Johnson's a tough player to judge at all. I think he's a legit great talent.
Well, that's a really good point that you make. And I honestly, not even something that I had considered, is that, has Ben Roethlisberger been holding Diontae Johnson back? I mean, and now, well, is he getting a legitimate quarterback now? I don't know about that. Right? Yeah. But I mean, I do think that there is a very realistic scenario where Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett or whatever are better than Ben Roethlisberger, considering how bad Ben Roethlisberger has been. And I've been on that side that has kind of chalked up some of Diontae Johnson's just extreme target volume to the playing style of Ben Roethlisberger, run 4 or 5 yards downfield. I mean, he's got like a 6-yard ADOT over the past couple seasons.
It's crazy.
And he's just running like little comeback sticks. And, but, could, a quarterback or in an offensive scheme that is not controlled by Ben Roethlisberger, who just wants to not get hit and get the ball out quickly, under like Matt Canada is going to be running the offense now. It's not going to be Ben Roethlisberger was running the offense. He was the offensive coordinator. Could we see more big plays from Diontae Johnson? It's something very fair to consider. And like, maybe I need to go back and rethink that a little bit.
I mean, one thing I would say is that, I don't think the Steelers share the same opinion of Diontae Johnson that Matt does, because from what I was reading, they have a chance to extend him and they don't want to. They don't want to give him Terry McLaurin type money, and they're probably going to let Diontae Johnson hit the market. I think Mark Cabley, who covers the Cincinnati Athletic, was like, oh yeah, Diontae Johnson's going to be a Packer in free agency next year, which, he has no idea, but I think the point was more like the Steelers aren't that interested in re-signing him right now, but we'll see.
Well, Mark Caballi is like literally works for the Steelers organization.
That's what I'm saying.
He's like literally he's the, Kaylee McEnany, Jen Psaki for the Steelers organization.
All right. I have 3 more here of lower tier guys we can go through quickly. Start with Treylon Burks. I know you look at the college guys as well, Matt. The Treylon Burks thing, I think people are scared because people think that he profiles similarly to Laviska Shenault coming out. In other words, he was manufactured targets in college, and he was so much more athletic and bigger and stronger than people he was playing against that he would catch like a screen pass and go for 15 yards, and that's how he was getting his production. Will that translate to the NFL level? So I've seen all kinds of different takes on what Treylon Burks' outlook is at the NFL level. What do you think about him? Because honestly, the Titans, need him badly.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously the camp reports have been terrible with Treylon Burks. Like he's out of shape. I know they're trying to like say he's got asthma or whatever, but he's definitely just out of shape. Like Mike Vrabel's clearly pissed about it. Whatever. So that's the problem with Treylon Burks, man, is that he needs Yeah, I know that it's people like, well, Treylon Burks' asthma is Jamar Chase's drops. It's like, dude, Jamar Chase was a polished product coming out of college. Like that guy could win all over the field, could win against press man coverage, could win as an X receiver. And like Treylon Burks just didn't do any of that as a collegiate player. Like 44% of his sampled routes in reception perception were a slant, a screen, or a flat. Like I think he would be and I know people hate Juju now, but I think he would be awesome in like a Juju Smith-Schuster big slot receiver type of role. Obviously, like the Treylon Burks bros don't want to hear that. You know, they think he's the next AJ Brown. I don't think he's the next AJ Brown like this year, and I don't think he's the next AJ Brown like coming down the pike or anything, unless he takes like a huge developmental leap, which is certainly possible. But it would be nice if he could actually like participate in practice. That'd be a good start.
Treylon Burks has been like one of the most polarizing players, I mean, I think so far this year for a variety of reasons, even before the asthma or conditioning issues that he's had. We had Mike Renner on here, and he studies these college the wide receiver prospects as much as anyone. His take on Treylon Burks was almost exactly the same as yours. And then you got, Daniel Jeremiah comparing him to AJ Brown. And, it's just like there's no in between here with Treylon Burks. And I don't know, I'm considering moving him down. I like Robert Woods. I mean, I think that the way that things are kind of, playing out for Robert Woods could be really positive for him. I think that he could vibe with Ryan Tannehill a lot. He's pretty far removed from that ACL. I mean, he's been practicing. So, I'm worried about Treylon Burks. It's not because he has asthma, but it's for a variety of different issues.
Harmon claims that he doesn't actually have asthma. He's faking. So put that on the record there. Okay. Two more here. Christian Kirk. I was like always a Christian Kirk guy. I thought that he would have been better in a different scheme than what the horizontal raid and Cliff Kingsbury was running. He gets that scheme. He gets a huge bag to be Trevor Lawrence's number one wide receiver. I think this is an interesting guy to isolate from scheme and quarterback. What do you think about Christian Kirk's chances of succeeding as a number one receiver in Jacksonville?
Yeah, we've talked about that kind of like 70% mark for success rate versus man for these perimeter guys. If you're like a slot receiver and you're over or at 80%, like that's a really promising mark for your future production. And Christian Kirk is at that. And he's not just like a little pop gun slot receiver either. He's a guy that can win on dig routes, out routes, corner routes, some stuff like more in the intermediate zones. So I really like Christian Kirk. It's just a shame that it's like you're not allowed to say nice things about Christian Kirk because of the stupid contract. And like, I get it. But if they had paid Christian Kirk like a normal amount of money, I think we'd all agree that this is like a perfect signing and exactly what Trevor Lawrence needs. Like nobody got open on that Jaguars team last year from week 1 till week 17. Like nobody was getting any separation. And Christian Kirk, like, is certainly not like a number one receiver or something like that, but he can get you those layup targets against zone coverage and also give you some more looks over the middle of the field, down the field, stuff like that. So I think he's a good player. Like he's a fine starting NFL slot receiver that can also play a little bit of flanker as well. So it's really, without the salary attached to it, it's a really great signing for the Jags.
Oh, it's idiotic to worry about the salary. He clearly has a good role. And I mean, it makes no sense. And I know Evan is super, super high on Christian Kirk this year as well.
Love to hear it.
Last one I want to ask about is personal because every time it gets to me in like the 18th round, I'm like, well, I guess I'll take Nico Collins again. And I'm on the clock in the 17th round. It's like, well, I guess I'll take Nico Collins again. And honestly, that's without me really worrying about his talent too much. I just think that the situation is way better than people think for Nico Collins. Now, I understand he was a huge yards per catch guy in college. I didn't really think much of him last year because the situation was not great. And obviously, like number 2 wide receivers for the Texans aren't going to be on the DFS radar a ton. But in these last round picks, I find myself taking Nico Collins a lot. So I'm curious what you think of him, Matt.
I like Nico Collins. I think he can play a little bit. Like he's at a 71% success rate versus press, like, which is great because he's a legit X receiver. Like if you squint at the Texans, you can kind of see the makings of a pretty good receiver core. Like Brandon Cooks, underrated flanker receiver, can move around pre-snap and can win down the field. Nico Collins is just built like a big X receiver, and he wins off the line of scrimmage like a big X receiver. I think he's kind of like, I mean, I'm not super bullish on Nico Collins, but I certainly agree, like taking him in the last couple of rounds is awesome. And he's kind of like a poor man's T. Higgins type of player, I think is like a good comparison for him. Like not going to burn you a ton down the field, not a big speed guy, but can win on those intermediate routes, digs, curls, stuff like that. Like that like I know this is super nerdy to talk about one particular route, but like it was like I think he's just an awesome dig route runner and is going to completely make a lot of big catches over the middle of the field, running those dig routes for Davis Mills. So yeah, if you squint at it and like Brandon Cooks, Nico Collins, John Mechie when he's healthy, I think is like a nice little rugged slot receiver. That's the makings of a pretty decent receiver core, and I agree. Nico Collins is kind of like overlooked as a guy who's gonna run right into a legit starting job and can play a little bit.
Yeah, and a year 2 leap, I think, for Davis Mills also, who I thought played pretty well as a rookie anyways. Evan, anybody we didn't touch on that you want to ask Matt about before we get out of here?
I think we covered pretty much. I really wanted to hear about Allen Robinson in particular. And I know he didn't have his best season, but man, I mean, this situation just really adds up nicely for him. No, I think we hit it. Christian Kirk was a guy I definitely wanted to hear about. I think we touched on all the guys I wanted to hear about.
Okay, perfect. This was awesome, Matt. We all learned a lot. Tell the people where they can find you on the social machine and where they can find your work.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Matt Harmon _BYB and receptionperception.com. We've got, I would say there's a small team working with me there, but like I'm the one doing all the work, so whatever. I've got a profile on over 50 NFL receivers, a bunch of college prospects as well, and then there's stuff like my Dynasty wide receiver rankings are up there. My redraft rankings will be up there as well. So not just like doing all of the big dork stuff with reception perception, although people should definitely go and check all that out. All the sortable data is up there. It's like I think people once they subscribe they'll be pleasantly surprised with how much stuff is up there.
All right. Perfect. We appreciate the time and the knowledge and the grinding on the charting, Matt. We will see you next year for your annual visit. I know the people will be waiting with bated breath. For
appreciate you guys.
Matt. For Evan. For producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.